All right, hi everyone. Today our goal is to use matrices to solve systems of linear equations, and we're going to do that, and it's called Gauss-Jordan elimination. It's named after these two mathematicians. The idea with Gauss-Jordan elimination is to get our matrices so that there are ones in the diagonals and zeros everywhere else. And then whatever these numbers are at the end, that's what your variables equal. So this would be x equals A, y equals B, and z equals C. So that is our goal when we are doing Gauss-Jordan elimination. So we're going to use the elementary row operations that we learned last week to get our matrices into this form. Remember, this is called reduced row echelon form. So once we get our matrix into reduced row echelon form, then we know that we are done with the problem. So let's get started. All right, so our first problem, we're gonna have the system x minus y plus z equals 0, negative x plus 2y minus 3z equals to negative 5, and 2x minus 3y plus 5z equal to 8. So that is our problem. And our first task is going to be to write this in augmented matrix form. So we know that it's going to be 3 rows and 4 columns. So it's 1, negative 1, 1, and then the constant is 0. Negative 1, 2, negative 3, constant negative 5. 2, negative 3, 5, constant 8. So here's our matrix in augmented form. Okay, our goal is to get ones in these 3 spots. We want to get ones in these 3 spots and zeros everywhere else. We want to get zeros here and we want to get zeros here. To do that, we are going to use elementary row operations, and the idea, we want to work left from the leftmost to right, but we also want to work bottom to top. So we want to start with the 2. So our first goal is to get a 0 in this spot. So what kind of elementary row operations are we going to do to get 0 here? Well, if I multiply row 2 times 2 and add it to row 3 and place everything in row 3, that will give me 0. So that's our first row operation that we are going to do. All right. So we're going to start with that. So before we do the math, I want to write out the rows that aren't changing. Since we're placing everything in row 3, row 1 stays the same, and row 2 stays the same. So the only thing we're changing is row 3. All right, let's do some math here. Okay, so I'm going to do 2 times row 2, so negative 1. I'm going to add it to row 3. Well, that equals 0. That 0 goes right here. Then I'm going to do 2 times 2. And I'm going to add it to negative 3. 4 plus negative 3 is a positive 1. So that 1 goes right here. Then we're going to do 2 times negative 3 plus 5. Negative 6 plus 5 is negative 1. That negative 1 goes here. And then we're going to do 2 times negative 5 plus 8. Negative 10 plus 8 is negative 2. And that negative 2 goes right here. All right. So now, I said we work left to right, bottom to top. So after we do this 0, we now want to take care of this 0. Well, how are we going to get 0 here? Well, if we take row 2 and add it to row 1, but keep it in row 2, that will give us 0. Okay. So what is that going to look like? Okay. Well, first let's write out the rows that aren't changing. We're moving everything to row 2, so row 1 stays the same, and row 3 stays the same. And now we're going to do our math, and we're going to just do row 2 plus row 1. So negative 1 plus 1 equals 0. That 0 goes right here. 2 plus negative 1 equals 1. That 1 goes right here. Negative 3 plus 1 is negative 2. That negative 2 goes right here. And negative 5 plus 0 is negative 5. That negative 5 goes right here. Great. So we got zeros here and here. So now we want to get a 0 right here. Okay. What can we do to get 0 here? Well, if I take row 3 and I add it to a negative row 2 and I keep it in row 3, that will give me 0. Okay, so let's start with how we've always started, and let's write out the rows that aren't changing. Row 1 doesn't change, and row 2 doesn't change. Okay, and now let's do our math. Row 3, so 0 plus negative 0 is just going to give us 0. So this number stays 0. Good. We don't want to go backwards, so that has to stay 0. Then we're going to take the 1, add it to negative 1. That's also 0. So 0 goes right here. Then we're going to take negative 1, add it to negative 2, so that's a positive 2. Negative 1 plus 2 is just a 1. That 1 goes here. And now we're going to do negative 2 plus the opposite of negative 5, so plus 5. And that gives us 3. And this 3 goes right here. Very good. All right, so we're halfway there. We have our zeros in the bottom triangle. Now we want to get, so I said we work left to right, bottom to top. So now we have to work this negative 2 right here. So this is the spot that we want to get a 0 in. Well, how are we going to get 0 here? Well, if we take 2, we multiply it by row 3, making this a positive 2, and we add it with row 2 and keep it in row 2, that will give a 0 here. All right, well, row 1 stays the same, so 1, -1, 1, 0. Row 3 stays the same, 0, 0, 1, 3. Now we just have to do our math. Well, we're going to do 2 times 0 plus 0. That's just going to give us 0. So this stays 0. And then we'll do 2 times 0 plus 1. That's 1. So this stays 1. Then we'll do 2 times 1 plus -2. 2 times 1 is 2, plus -2 is 0. So this spot changes to 0. And then we'll do 2 times 3 plus -5. That's 6. 6 and a -5 is a 1. And so this spot is now 1. Good. All right. Let's just scroll up a little bit. Okay, so now we want to get a 0 here. How are we going to do that? Well, if I do negative row 3 and I add it to row 1 and I keep everything in row 1, because -1 plus 1 is 0. So that's going to give us a 0 there. All right. So again, let's start with writing our rows that aren't changing. Row 2 isn't changing, and row 3 isn't changing. And now let's do our math. So negative row 3, I don't have to do the zeros because that's just 0. So 0 plus 1 is 1. So this entry stays 1. 0 plus -1 is -1. So this entry stays -1. But then we're going to do negative, we're going to change this to negative, so because it's negative row 3. So negative row 3 plus 1 equals 0. This changes to 0. And then -3 plus 0 is -3. So this changes to -3. All right, we only have one more step left to do. Now we have to look at this 0. We want to get 0 here. Well, if I just add row 1 and row 2 together, we'll get 0. So I'm going to take row 2 plus row 1, and we're going to keep it in row 1. So we're going to write the rows that don't change. So that's row 2 doesn't change, and row 3 doesn't change. And now we're going to just do the math, row 2 plus row 1. Well, 0 plus 1 is 1, so this entry stays 1. And then 1 plus -1 is 0, so this entry changes to 0. 0 plus 0 is 0, so this entry is 0. And then we are going to do 1 plus -3. And that's going to give us -2. So this entry is -2. So now we have to check, are we done? Well, we have 1s along the diagonals and 0s everywhere else. So we are done, and we have our final answer. So x equals -2, y equals 1, and z equals 3. And that is the answer to our problem.